Are you a pianist who's new to jazz? There's no time like the present to get started. And welcome to the Musician Toolkit. My name is David Lane, your host. This is episode number 6, and we're going to be talking about Jazz Piano 101. But before we get into that, I just want to say thanks to Fonz. Fonz is an app that I've been using for several months, and it just occurred to me at some point this month that I'm not really sure if so and so had paid, and then I realized, oh yeah, they're on Fonz. Their payment comes out automatically the same time every month. Of course they've paid, and I know what it is, and I can go look it up, and I can verify the record. It gives me so much more time to focus on teaching rather than chasing payments. That's just one of many great things about it. You don't have to be a music teacher. You can be a yoga instructor, martial arts teacher, anything, physical fitness, physical therapist. I know I can get the word out. If you meet with clients, it involves scheduling, it involves billing, Fonz will take care of all of that for you and automate it. You can try it for free and subscribe if it fits you. And there's a link in the show notes that you can go do that. One of the tools that I believe every great musician needs to have is the ability to play in multiple genres. And I find this is especially true when it comes to classical musicians. There's an attitude that can be absorbed through some conservatories around the country that classical is on a level all of its own, and if you play that, you don't need to bother with any other kind of music. But that is not the way I find that really great musicians, especially great modern musicians, think. Most people who can play all of their classical repertoire not only can, but sometimes really enjoy playing in other styles of music. And sometimes those other styles of music, as I mentioned in episode 5, are ones that you might want to be able to learn in different ways. So not just, here's the sheet music, everything's written out for you, play it, which is a great skill to have. And I would say, if I'm talking to jazz musicians out there, we need to have an episode for you, because you need to be able to just read the music sometimes. That's a great skill to have. But we are talking today, and this is where I should say, this episode might not be for everyone. If you already play jazz piano, fine, but you're here for the episodes that talk about other things, then I'm fine if you want to skip this episode. This is specific to piano, but I would encourage you to listen even if you play another instrument, because, of course, having a little knowledge of the piano is one of the 20 tools. So even if a pianist is not how you identify, I'm encouraging you to get some piano skills, and it just so happens we're talking about very basic skills, really, to get started, but in the language of jazz. So to discuss this with me today, I have asked the help of a local colleague and friend, Federico Pivetta. And I'll be calling him Fred throughout the interview, if you're wondering why that is. I know him as Fred, but his name is Federico. And he is local to my area, Winston-Salem, as one of the biggest jazz pianists in the area. He plays sometimes by himself, but he also plays with a trio. He plays with a quartet. I believe he plays with a quintet. I know we clarified that in the interview. And I specifically asked him to play not just because he's a great pianist, but because he is also a classical pianist and a classical teacher. And sometimes when you're trying to learn jazz and you're not a jazz musician, but you understand a little bit about classical music, it can be frustrating when your teacher is basically only jazz because they have their own language and they're not really relating to you. Federico is someone who does understand both worlds of classical and jazz. So today we're primarily talking to classical pianists, or I should say pianists or students. So you might be learning, even in a method book, you might be learning through sheet music and you're interested in jazz. And we're going to talk about the language of jazz, which you could learn in any form. But then we're also going to talk about, what would you do if you come across a lead sheet? What are some things that you can do? Now, just a little technical information. Federico gives a lot of examples at his piano, and we recorded this on Zoom. And unfortunately, with Zoom, you sometimes have to choose, do you want a decent speaking sound or decent musical instrument sound? And, it's a podcast, so, I want the best possible speaking sound. So a lot of the piano examples are not as good as sounding, not as well sounding as they could be. And some of them actually get a little bit lost. But I think most of them are good enough that you'll be able to kind of tell, especially piecing together what we're talking about, what's going on. If you have any questions at all, if something doesn't make sense on this podcast and you don't quite understand it, you want to know more about it, please leave me a message, and you can leave me a voice message, and let me know if you want it to be included on the podcast. And it's something that I can answer in show, or send me a message through my website, or DM me on social media, and I'll put all of that information, of course, in the show notes and at the end of this episode. Let's get into this. Jazz 101. This is my conversation with Federico Pivetta. So, Fred, it's great to chat with you today. Thanks for taking time to talk with me.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah. I always like to ask guests, because I think, 99% of the guests I have on here are not going to be able to be super specific with their job description. They're not going to be able to say, I'm a full-time touring pianist, I'm a full-time composer. There are people like that out there, but I think most of us who are successful as musicians kind of have, a little quilt, little branches of things that we do that go under that job description. So what are the things that you do professionally?
Well, I'm a full-time musician. I am a graduate of the School of the Arts, UNCSA, sorry to be correct.
No problem.
And I have, I graduated there in 1986. And I have a studio here. I teach privately, and I also do a lot of freelance work. I play, with the Greensboro Symphony. I do pops concerts. I play a jazz quintet. I play with all sorts of different groups, combinations of instruments and so forth. I'm not per se, some people call me a keyboard player. I play a little bit of electronic keyboards, but not that much. But yeah, I'm pretty much a full-time pianist. That's what I do as an instructor and also as a freelance musician.
Right. So, and one of the things we're going to be talking about today is we're going to talk about, kind of the classical world versus the jazz world, because you're very comfortable in both. And this is actually very relevant to me because until I went to the same school, North Carolina School of the Arts, I had no experience with jazz whatsoever. I was completely a classical musician. And, mutual friend of ours, I'm sure, Ron Rudkin, taught jazz arranging, jazz orchestration.
Yeah.
That opened my world to, to that possibility. And I think that every musician, even if you say, I love jazz or I love classical, should have some experience with the other. I don't think you should be completely pigeonholed and inexperienced, in anything out there, even if you have a favorite. So I thought maybe let's go ahead and just start, since you play classical piano and you play jazz piano, what do you think are some of the different challenges of each?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, here's when we play what we call classical music, I mean, whether it could be Baroque, from the classical period, Romantic, Impressionistic, we always have to read the music exactly 100% verbatim.
Yep.
That's, and of course, I mean, there are we learn about the different styles, the difference between playing Bach to playing Rachmaninoff or something like that, or any other composer. When we play jazz, first of all, there are some specific rhythms, some specific styles, And of course, I mean, then we get into having the knowledge of being able to interpret a chord. You know, when we see actually what we call a fake book or a real book, what it's called these days, when you have just
Right.
a melody and then you have what we call chord changes underneath it. It's very similar to playing figure bass in a way. Like, I don't read figure bass. I mean, I studied it a little bit in college, but I never was proficient at it.
Hmm.
So that's going to be, and then of course improvisation,
Right.
to how to take a chord and develop around it. What do you play? I mean, do I play a scale? Do I play an arpeggio? Do I play some, you know, a pattern, or whatever? So that's kind of, I think, the two main differences between playing classical music and playing jazz.
Yeah.
So technique always has to be very good. Um,
Yeah.
Most of the great jazz pianists, or a number of jazz pianists, they've always studied classical piano or traditional. Let's call it traditional piano. I mean, I
Right.
prefer that word because classical is more of a colloquial form of the
Right.
music. But that really develops your technique, develops your knowledge of how to get around the piano, fingering, touch, and all of those aspects are important in jazz, just like when you play traditional piano or classical music. That's what I think are the two main differences.
Mm.
So
Nice. You know, as you were talking, it occurred to me, and maybe I thought this before and forgot, but you know, being a jazz pianist is kind of like being a Baroque keyboardist in an ensemble. You have
absolutely,
just a little bit of information, but there's also you're improvising. If you're playing a solo of any instrument, there's improvisation in the
yeah,
cadenza. So yeah.
yeah. If yeah, I was going to mention that a little bit later, but yeah. For example, I've always thought that Bach was the greatest jazz musician that ever was. I mean,
Right.
and a lot of, and you know, you hear his music, and it has a great sense of improvisation to it. And that's something that, you know, as you know, Baroque musicians and a lot of musicians used to improvise on the keyboard a lot. It was different. Of course, they were not familiar with swing or Latin music or rock, jazz, fusion, but the art of improvisation was present in that music at the time. So,
Yeah.
and that's, you take a chord progression of some sort and develop an idea, you know, melodically. So that's what I was.
Just as a matter of clarification, for the listeners and for those that are watching on YouTube, um, I wanted to share, just before this episode comes out with this interview, I'm going to put out a very short episode that that's something that's an idea that I've had. I've never read it anywhere else. So, you know, you may agree, you may disagree, but I think that there's two approaches to music. There's the classical approach and the jazz approach,
Yeah,
and that's regardless of the genre. So it's possible to take a classical approach to jazz and a jazz approach to classical. So for my instance, classical is what you said, everything's written down, or most
yeah,
of it's written down, very little for you to add to the composition. So, you know, I've got books in my studio that are like full Dave Brubeck transcriptions, and
absolutely.
they're full big band Glenn Miller transcriptions. I just play what I see. That's a classical approach to jazz.
Yeah,
But on my shelf behind me, I have something called the classical fake book. I can play a whole Johann Strauss Jr. waltz on one page, and it has chord symbols, and that's a jazz approach to classical.
right, right, right,
So
right.
and you can apply that. I've got rock and roll fake books. I've also got
Absolutely.
rock and roll sheet music. So we're going to be talking today about the jazz approach to
Yeah,
jazz. You know, so we're going to be checking that out. And so I guess the first thing that we want to talk about is the harmonic language of jazz. You know, so because when we talk about classical, we're talking about primarily three note chords, you know, root, third, fifth,
absolutely.
and a relation. But talk to us about what are some of the basics and some of the elaborations of the jazz language.
Right. Well, what is very peculiar of jazz, it's actually that, like you said, I mean, we just don't are not, and I'm at the piano, I can play a couple of things if you like me to.
Sure.
Um, Whatever, one thing that is very typical of jazz is that we actually get into seventh chords. I mean,
Hmm.
as a jazz instructor, you have to understand what a seventh chord is instead of just as a triad.
Yeah.
Um, For example, what gives jazz that flavor, I think, is actually the different notes that we add. So if we take a major triad, then we start adding a seventh to it. Then we start adding what we call a ninth, which is pretty much a second, a sharp 11th, which is a raised fourth. And then you have actually something that starts to sound more in the jazz idiom. I'm going to backtrack just a little bit.
Yeah.
Composers like Debussy and Ravel started using those chords.
Yes.
So obviously in the classical period, the music, remember, for example, that if you did something like this, you know, parallel fifths, oh no, you were probably executed by the king who was supporting you or something. Because the music, I'm pretty sure that Salieri and Amadeo and Mozart never did that. So there are going to be those particular sound, those particular extensions of the chord that are going to give it that flavor. Now, and of course, just like jazz has seen, you know, traditional music has seen an evolution through the centuries. There's also been an evolution through the past 120 years.
Right.
Starting with ragtime, then we get into the big band sounds, then we get into bebop, then we get into more modern sounds, and then, you know, and then who knows what else is going to be coming up in the future. So yeah, those particular flavors, those notes, and then of course we have to, you know, then I know we want to talk a little bit about voicings. So we don't have to play everything in group position. Yeah, it's actually, we could sit here for 2 hours actually.
Oh, I know.
But anyway, just very, very briefly, yeah, there are going to be specific ways of playing a chord. So,
you know, one thing I wanted to just comment on, you gave a little demonstration of like the parts of a chord, and you know, you didn't play an 11th, you played a sharp 11th. And my understanding is this is if you're in a major, like you could get away with it in a minor 7, but if you're doing a major you know, iteration, you've got a half step conflict, you know, that really jars. Yeah.
There's some musicians call it, I mean, and again, we get into modes and all these other things. Now, some, for example, that particular sharp 11th that we're talking about, which is also nothing else but a raised fourth and an octave higher. Anyway, if we play, when we have a C major chord, for example, I'm going to use C because I mean, that actually sounds pretty nice. And I did actually not play, I played an F natural. But if I hold on to that note, it first of all, can be very dissonant, has a very unstable feel, like if I play a sharp fourth, that actually has a resolving power. Now, with that said, that particular fourth can be used as a passing tone. I mean, I'm probably trying not to get too technical. So by that note, going by so quickly, it doesn't, it's not a resolving, I mean, then you can actually, the note sounds quote unquote correct. So,
well, you know, back to talking about Bach as a jazz musician, you know, one of the things I have to warn all of my students about when they get ready for, you know, not just like Anna Magdalena Bach, but, you know, the real Bach repertoire, I have to tell them, if you're going to practice this slowly and you're going to question whether or not the notes are right at times, because he puts a lot of, you know, non-chord tones on the beat against each other.
That is absolutely correct. Yeah, because I mean, what happens, and this happens to, you know, students, I mean, they tell me this note doesn't sound right. I mean, you know, well, what about when you play it in a sequence? You know, it is going to sound right. I mean, you know, and of course, that's actually our natural ear and the natural instinct of hearing something dissonant that actually doesn't sound right. But yeah, that's exactly that happens to me also when I teach, you know, some classical pieces. I mean, as we get into some more colorful music, there's the harmony tends to be more sophisticated, more complex. So that's gonna happen. Yes, I completely agree with you on that one. So
okay. Also, just to clarify for the listeners and the viewers, you know, kind of going forward and really what the conversation we've already started, kind of assuming that you are studying music at the moment, or that you're already an accomplished musician, but but jazz is new, so we may be using some terms and things that, that's kind of assuming that you've got a musical background. So this episode's probably not if you're a brand new musician from scratch and trying to learn, although you can probably learn a few things. But with that in mind, I think one of the best ways to get into jazz from my perspective is to, get a fake book, which is a collection of lead sheets. And for those, who don't know, a lead sheet is just basically a single line melody with
Exactly.
chord
Yeah.
symbols.
Melody and a
And
single.
and I would start, for me, I always like to pick something like Time After Time or My Funny Valentine, something kind of slow ballad. But the early stages, I think that if you just put this in front of a student and they know what's expected, what's going to happen is they're going to play just what's on on the staff
Yeah.
with the right hand, and they're gonna find like what I call the textbook chords in the left. It's like you can find these chord charts where like it'll show C major 7, C, E, G, B.
Exactly. So everybody tends to, because I mean, and also I attribute that to, when we study traditional harmony, I mean, everybody's going to play everything in root position. But then again, we can elaborate a little bit, and I can play a little bit later. Just like what there's going to be a tendency to play everything in root position, meaning the chord.
Right.
And then, of course, it's going to start sounding not right, especially because then we get into registers, into the overtone series, and all these other things that are probably a little bit more complicated.
Right.
But yeah, it's developing. Eventually we can talk a little bit about when we get to voicings, which is kind of in a way like the inversion of a chord. But then we can get a little bit more in depth with that, obviously.
Yeah, I think we're kind of at a place where we could talk a little bit about that, just kind of because I want to talk about like getting it to sound more professional. So
absolutely.
So like one thing that comes to mind for me is you don't have to do these tones in that order. It doesn't have to be root third, fifth, seventh. It could be root fifth, seventh, third, or something like that.
Absolutely.
Or yeah. So like, since you're at the piano, demonstrate just some different ways of opening up a C major 7. What are some ways?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm gonna start with something extremely basic. This is a C major 7th chord, which is basically C, root, third, fifth, and seventh of the chord. I can play with my left hand. It sounds okay.
Yeah.
Now I can start adding a couple of extensions. For example, what we call the 9th, which is a second. Okay. Now, then we start developing a couple of other different voicings. And again, I'm going to be using that word a bit here. Voicings is just a way on how to build the chord, in what order we stack the notes to give everything a particular flavor. As we get lower into the keyboard, what sounds okay here, down an octave, it doesn't start to sound very good because this is a very congested area of the chord. So we have to open up the chord. So something very, very simple to do is just to take, for example, the chord and just play root. And all of a sudden we have this very beautiful and rich chord. Of course, this takes a little bit of practice. Then, you have to show different options on how to do this. We also get a little bit higher into the keyboard. Beautiful, beautiful open chord instead of
yes.
Which doesn't really. It's basically boring and dull. So that's what happens.
Well, this reminds me. I'm always thinking about what are my future episodes going to be, and I think one that I forgot to add to my list is an introduction to the overtone series. So I think we may follow up this episode with that.
I'm not going to touch that one. I sort of. How it works, but I'll let you explain that in the next podcast.
Yeah, well, when I go to explain it to the students, I have to make sure that I've got a good 10 minutes, just to...
Oh, absolutely. At least, yes. Or just send him a YouTube link somewhere here. Just figure it out on your own.
Yeah, I should just record a video and just like, okay,
exactly.
Go check this out. Yeah, exactly. That's great. Yeah, so when I like to think about like playing by yourself. This is something I don't think I really included this. Like there's a different mindset when you're playing with, say, like a saxophone or trumpet
Absolutely.
player as opposed to by yourself. But when you're by yourself and you don't have a bassist, you don't have, anything else. I've always liked to think of playing a lead sheet as kind of defining three zones with two hands. So it's like
Yeah.
your right hand has the melody almost exclusively. Your left hand has the bass line
Yes.
almost exclusively, but then you have the rest of the chord, which could be either hand. That's kind of in the middle.
Yes.
It's like you might be combining with the thumb and the two part of your hands.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And then, of course, also then depends on the span of the person. I have a fairly good reach, can reach a tenth or so. But yeah, there's like, for example, there are, like you said, there are three, and I generally teach this. There are three ways, and again, this is very general, three ways of playing jazz piano. When you're playing by yourself, like you said, that you can use a bass line, if you choose to do so. Now, when you're playing with an instrumentalist, let's say that I'm actually playing with a sax player or a trumpet player or whatever other instrument, I can still do that, because then I will probably not play as much melody until I actually get to the point where I'm going to play a solo. Yeah. When I play in a band, which is generally going to be, let's assume the most typical, a piano trio or a piano quartet. Piano trio meaning piano, bass, and drums, or a piano trio adding an extra horn. Then generally I will not be playing bass lines, because the bass player is actually doing that. Also, the voicing is going to have to change, because I cannot play everything with a root, because then you get into clashing issues of intonation. Yeah. Plus, the other thing that is nice about I hate to use this word, convenient. it opens up your possibility of not having, you can have more chord, the chords can become more complex, because you would definitely have more fingers left. Yeah. Let's say if I play a little swing, a 1, 2, 3, 4. And then in the background, probably the bass player might be doing, a bass line of sort, and the drums are doing their thing and so forth. So there are a set of rules / guidelines on what to do. So yeah.
Nice.
Anyway.
Kind of thinking about harmony just for a moment, are there some exercises that you might recommend, to someone who's kind of new at jazz, to just kind of get used to getting some fluency in the jazz harmonies, and also like chord progressions? I like, the only one that I really know is
251.
251, yeah. And I should probably say that real quick. If you're classical, you might, know there's a 5-note chord progression. Every textbook shows you 1-4-1-5 or 5-7-1. But
yes,
it's simpler than that, but it's a little different in jazz. It's 2-5-1 and 2 minor 7, 5-7-1 major 7 is kind of the way we go. But
yeah, when we play chord progressions, which like in several contests, that we are required to play 1, 4, 1, 5, 5/7, 1. Okay. Yeah. Now you mentioned the 2-5-1. Why do we always go to the 2-5-1? The 2-5-1 it's definitely at least in the more traditional tunes that we know, circle of fifths and so forth. That's going to be a chord progression that is very going to be present. So that's why we stress practicing that. Now, do we play like this? And to explain very briefly to the listener or the viewer, is the 2 chord, which is minor, the 5, which is dominant, and the 1 that is major. Right. But that sounds really terrible. Yeah. First of all, it's just boring, dull, doesn't sound great. So there are actually a couple of exercises that I use. And it's actually to play, for example, I'm going to play it, and then I'm going to play 2 different ways, and then I think the listener will hear the difference. Pretty boring, doesn't have a lot of color. Yeah. So what I'm doing now, I'm actually going to change this a little bit. In my right hand, I'm going to play, and then in the 5/7, and that's the 1 chord. That right there immediately opens up a huge new world of progressions. So then, of course, there are different ways of voicing this. This is a very, very basic voicing. Then again, we get into that issue of register as we get lower in the piano.
Yeah.
It starts to get very, very muddy. So
Yeah.
I will say generally the sweet spot, quote unquote, this is not, it's going to be, I will say 10 notes down from middle C to about an octave above middle C, a little bit higher. It depends on the color. You can play higher in the keyboard, and it gives you a different tone. You can play low on the keyboard. So it depends on what color you're looking for. But to start, I will definitely start with 251, with a 251 progression. Then you can change the voicing. Instead of playing like this, you can play like this. And that way gives it a very, very beautiful color. And what makes it exciting for the students, like, wow, now I'm starting to sound like a jazz pianist. I mean, and not, it doesn't sound so boring and dull, basically. So,
and what you're doing is, and this is something that I had to get used to when I first started playing jazz, is like your chart might say D minor 7, but that you're by no means does that mean don't do a 9th, 11th, or 13th.
absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely, yeah. That is a very good question, because we have all these extensions. Like, for example, in a minor chord, we can add a 9th. Then if you had a dominant 7 is the chord that really gives you a lot of bang.
Yeah.
That's a sharp 9th. So there's all those chords. So a lot of places, like there's a book that I really love, and is this one. I'm a big fan of this book called The Jazz Pianist, Mark Levine. This book has been out for, close to 30 years. Actually, I met Mark. He's an incredible writer. And then I have tons of other things here, but I don't know if I want to show all of this. And he talks about what kind of color you're looking, the texture, the sound, where you want to have it. But yeah, when I see D minor, it's obviously not going to be a triad. I will obviously consider always starting at least with a 7th, with actually part of the 7th chord family, and then develop it from there. So
yeah, I noticed when you gave an example of the 251 that was a little bit more colorful, like your 5 actually, it had a 13, but didn't have an 11th. It had a 7th, a 9th, a 3rd, and a 13th.
Talked earlier about this one. Yeah. So here I'm playing the root on the left hand, the 7th on my right, 9th, 3rd, and then the 13th or the 6th.
Yeah.
Because of course the 11th, it has to be a natural part of the mixolydian. I'm sorry. Dorian mode.
Right. Now I've heard so I've read that book from Mark, and many jazz musicians say is that you should make a habit of practicing everything in all the keys, so I like, if you're going through these chord progressions, you should go through them in all the keys. I mean, that's standard advice for classical as well.
Sure.
But the way I understand it best is that it flows so naturally in a circle of fifths, going counterclockwise. But is that what you recommend, or do you have any other suggestions for?
Yeah, well, actually, I use this. I don't have it here with me. There is I use a slightly different way of doing this. I use a sequence. For example, we start in the 251 of C. Then we turn that chord into a minor chord.
Yeah.
And then we have to probably change the register, because that's when it starts to get a little muddy. So we can reset the hand. So yeah, you can do it using the circle of fifths. What happened, that actually becomes the one chord, the sequences goes down in whole steps. And then, of course, you have to start the same chord progression a half step higher. etc. So that way you can cover all the 12 keys that we have, when we play in the piano. So
Nice.
yeah.
So, I had on my notes I wanted to talk about, getting a little bit better to lead sheet, but a question I didn't think to ask is, do you have maybe a short list of beginning jazz tunes that are good to start with? So I threw out a couple. I threw out Time After Time, My Funny Valentine. I also have found just for getting the chords out of the left hand, like Girl from
Hmm.
Ipanema is a pretty
Absolutely.
good one.
Yeah.
What are
Yeah.
a few others that you might think of?
I like, for example, Just Friends,
Hmm.
which is, I'm going to play it in a very, very simplified version. And it has a lot of 2-5-1 movement. Now, one of the easiest ways to start playing jazz is also that we obviously have to talk about playing blues,
Oh yeah.
the 12-bar blues progression. And you can start with something very, very, very simple. F, F is a great key on piano. And you don't have to start playing with something, nothing that's a little bit more exotic. But we can use like a very simple voicing in the left hand, and we can, it's basically the blues progression is 12 bars. That's what it's called, a 12-bar blues is. And we use a very simple voicing in the left hand of the third and the seventh, and seventh and third. If we start playing blues like this, that's already a no-no,
Yeah.
because I'm playing everything in real position. So very, very simple. 2, 3, 4, 4, 2. And we can use a very simple devices. So that is obviously, and it's the other thing that I like about the blues progression, that is incredibly short, it's fairly simple, and you can memorize it, and
Yeah.
then of course memorizing music is very, very, very paramount, very, very
Nice.
important. Yeah.
When I think about lead sheets, when I get students that are like, I'd like to learn some jazz, I'm going to share what I offer in my lessons as kind of stepping stones to being able to have it sound pretty good. And you can tell me if you agree or if there's something that you would add or take away. But for me, I always say, well, first thing is, just play the melody, just the right hand, just
Absolutely.
kind of get
Yeah.
that. And then what I will suggest to them is just find the root of each chord and put it in the left hand. Just give yourself and just kind of maybe put your hands about 2 octaves apart. You might change it when you add chords, but just kind of let's get the what it sounds like with with a very basic bass line. And then sometimes what I'll have them do if they're really new, I might tell them, let's just make an index of the chords and how you spell them. And then what you want to look for is what's missing and start adding maybe one note or two notes,
Mhm.
just to kind of fill them up and figure out what kind of fingering you need for the right hand. So this point you're getting basic chords, but we're bypassing the whole let's spell it root third, fifth, seventh,
Yeah.
but we're getting the bass line, we're getting the melody, and then we're seeing what space is in between and figuring out how to kind of fill that space evenly, just to get started. And then we start thinking about, okay, now let's get into the rhythm. Let's see if we can spice up the chords a little bit. So that's kind of me. That's level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm not sure how
Yeah.
many. Uh, I mean, does that sound good to you, or do you have any
Absolutely. Yeah.
other
Very,
approach?
yeah, it's a very, very good approach. But just like I gave that example with this very simple blues progression,
Yeah.
you don't need to have, and everybody, what is happening, a lot of students will generally want to play a ton of stuff.
Hmm.
Um, uh, and it's, yes, you can do that, but you have to be proficient at it. And
Right.
that comes with time. I can cite a great musician, one of the greatest musicians ever, Miles Davis. I mean, who
Yeah.
played so little, but it has so much so much feeling. I mean, you know, that of
Yeah.
course, I mean, with a trumpet, you're allowed to hold notes longer. With the piano, you don't have that luxury. But
Hmm.
like I mentioned before, earlier in the blues progression, you can actually even take what we call the chord tones. Let's talk about the root, you know, the root third, fifth. Now, we don't want to play like this.
Yeah.
Basically just spelling like we've been talking about, spelling the chord. So, and I know that you mentioned something, how to practice.
Mm-hmm.
You can actually take, like you said, the root on the top. And, you know, and I'm talking a medium swing here, which
Yeah.
is, you know, probably it's, and again, we don't want to start with something like giant steps.
Yeah.
I mean, that's way too hard. I mean, it's very,
Yeah.
very, so we want to lock on something simple, because something simple can sound really, really, really nice. But then you have to obviously play it correctly. I mean, I'm talking correct notes, correct feel. Even playing the root. And I think that sounds good. And there's also an incentive for the student to go, man, that actually, and always, always have a student record. And
Yeah.
we're going to get to the listening part of listening to jazz also.
Right.
Yes, to the transcript. Anyway, so I
So
hope
one
that.
of the things that I know that's very important, we need to talk about, an important ingredient in jazz we already mentioned already, is improvisation.
Yes.
And I have to confess that this is a weakness of mine as a teacher, probably because I've always done it. And you know,
Yeah.
the things that come
Come
natural that no
natural.
one
Sure.
really
Absolutely.
it's hard to
Yes.
teach someone how to do it, but maybe you've thought about it. Like what are some ways to get someone kind of just nudged into improvising?
Yeah. You can actually take, I'm going to start, I'm going to backtrack just a little bit.
Okay, sure.
Then again, the student or the person has to have a pretty good ear to be able to transcribe some solos, and we'll get to that. But let's say something very simple. You can start, for example, playing on a chord, just like when we practice arpeggios, etc. You can do the same thing with so it gives it a jazz flavor. For example, let's say that we put a voicing in the left hand. You know, so I'm taking basically the chord and playing an arpeggio, b b b d d d d d. Then we can change it. And of course, again, that starts to develop. When we get a little bit better, we can start adding a ninth to it. And then little by little, you can actually do variations of that particular pattern. So forth. So those are some exercises, just taking an arpeggio. If we play a scale, okay, and we can actually break it into thirds. And we something never do to finish with the root.
Yeah. That'll get you kicked out of every jazz club.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. Watch out for it, okay?
Those are very good suggestions. One thing that kind of crossed my mind is kind of like really getting started is if you're working on a chart, standard, like time after time, I might suggest, change one thing about the melody every measure or every two measures. Just kind of like
Yes.
add some notes,
Embellish. Totally.
yeah,
Yeah.
and then eventually try to get rid of try to get rid of the whole melody and just try to do the
Yeah.
embellishments, so
Again, I mean, also, and you're familiar with the real books. I mean, of course, I mean, we've been doing that. That is nothing else, but it's just a very simple template
yeah.
to, it's like, for example, let me give you an example with a song that is very popular. It's Autumn Leaves. If you, I don't have it here, but then I'm not you've seen it. If you look at the music, Autumn Leaves is written like this. And it sounds awful. I mean, it's just so we can actually play, change the rhythm. And then also add a little bit of a more colorful note. So all those little, it's kind of like cooking, and start adding a little bit of spices to whatever you're making. Then, of course, I mean, you start out very, very simple. What are the colorful notes? For example, a half step.
Yeah.
That little half step instead of that right there immediately gives the melody a much better color. And then, of course, the other thing that is absolutely, I think, is absolutely crucial. When you're practicing a solo, you have to do it in rhythm, some sort of a rhythmical foundation. Otherwise, you end up what we call noodling. If I play blues like this, there's absolutely no rhythm whatsoever.
Yeah.
And the solo has to have a certain, has to be rhythmically meaningful. Otherwise, it sounds. And Daniel's like, I don't sound good. And I hear people telling me, I have a couple of young students they really love to listen to jazz. And I said, yeah. And I'm giving them an example why this sounds bad or indifferent or kind of dull, why this sounds better. Generally, a lot of the times it's going to be rhythm, because it's got to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. It has to be done. If we just play, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, and it just doesn't sound musical at all. So
yeah.
Yeah.
You kind of hinted at talking about transcription. That's certainly a way of, like, go listen to some solos and write it down. I'll say if you're really one of those people that learns by reading and memorizing, there are plenty of books out there that have been like here's all the transcriptions from Duke Ellington, and all that, and you can play them, memorize them. But I think ultimately, if you just memorize them like visually, that's not going to help. But if you analyze it, you got to analyze it, see why these notes. And
I have, for example, there's a series that I really love, which is this one right here. This is actually by Hal Leonard, and in the back they have all these different. They have smooth jazz, bossa nova jazz, Christmas songs. That's another aspect that you can actually jazztize Christmas tunes, jazz. I mean, anyway.
Right.
But then what I do also, sometimes some students that are proficient in technique, I will actually, let's look at this bar right here, and we're getting into something a little bit more intense. What can you change? And I have them analyze, the chord. You have actually chord changes written: F dominant 7 flat 9 sharp 13, whatever it is. But yeah, I learned a lot reading transcriptions, because I will see, this is really cool. This really sounds great. There is a book that I really have become very fond of lately. Is actually this Playing Jazz Piano. This is by Bob Minzer, who's an incredible arranger and the terrific saxophone, incredible saxophonist, lists his own band. And he does a beautiful approach to this, actually. And what I love about it, it's very short. It's not like, so it's like, oh my gosh. I love Mark Levine's book, but that is for a person who really understands harmony, and it can get frustrating after a while. So, So
Great.
I love reading transcriptions. Absolutely. I mean, I do. I have this Bill Evans version of this book, and the solos are gorgeous. I mean, it's just very, very pretty. So is there one specific way to do this? No. And again, I'm going to stress, listening and transcribing. It is something very simple. We have a wonderful tool that we had, and nowadays it's called YouTube, in which
Yes.
you take a solo, slow it down without altering the pitch. And probably Dave, you and I remember, oh man, I really like that song. So we have to like go buy the record or on a cassette player. I mean, I grew up, I'm 62 years old, and I will rewind until I finally got the solo. Now it's so much easier. A lot of places, I'm not saying go to YouTube and you learn how to play jazz. I mean,
Yep.
but there are actually places where you can slow it down, and there's a score scrolling by.
Yeah.
And so the tools that we have, technology, sometimes, I mean, we complain about technology that is taking over our lives, but that aspect right there has really, really made a great contribution to learning music. So,
Right.
yeah, transcribing is very, very, very important. Of course, and then the student has to have a good ear and so forth, and and all that.
So I had a topic I think we may put off to another day down the road, because this, the more I thought about it, this is not for beginning jazz players, but it's kind of next level, and that's the concept of rootless voicings. I just kind of,
Mhm.
I just mentioned that a lot of jazz pianists, and the surprising thing to me when I read Mark's book was they do this even when they don't have a basis. A lot of times they almost, the ear will fill in, what's supposed to be there. But it's the idea that like you see a C major 7, C, E, G, B, but instead you do an E minor 9, you go E, G, B, D, and or something like that. And the C is gone. It might pop up in the melody. And I'll say that that has been the closest thing to mind-boggling that I've had to encounter. It's like I can't look at a C7 and not to a C, but it's
Yeah,
very
I,
hard.
I think I know what you're talking about. I'm gonna play. For example, if
Yeah,
I play this chord here, it's an F major 7, right?
yeah,
Right. But not necessarily. If I put a D in my left hand, now it's a minor chord. It's just like, for example, when we have what is the chord that I'm talking? A C minor 6.
yeah.
It's also half diminished chord in an
Hmm.
inversion. So yeah, so, when finally after a long time, I mean, of playing this, you can actually start seeing that this is a major chord. And that becomes more, then that's a minor chord. There is a chapter in Mark's book where he talks about all of that. Actually, I don't remember exactly the page. How a voicing can be several different chords. It's not just, okay, this is only an E minor 7 chord.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can probably definitely talk about that.
Yeah,
More.
yeah, that's getting into some next level stuff there,
Absolutely. Sure.
and I would say if you're beginning jazz, leave that part out, but eventually you may want to explore that. Um, okay, so the last thing that I have as far as like playing and stuff is if you're, so I guess I should say that the when I met you, it was because of something I did in the past that I'm sure my wife wishes was in the present still, and that was, you used to play for an annual Christmas party, a
Yes.
ballroom dance, and it was, it's you, bass and drums, you had a trio,
Yes.
and, one of the things that I know you have to do for that is you're playing jazz, of course, you're doing all the things we talked about, but it's kind of, you can't go on 10-minute, 12-minute pieces. It's got to be, a certain
Very
time
short.
frame,
Yes.
and it has to fit the rules of certain dances, like a foxtrot, a waltz, rumba, cha-cha, but also some things like merengue and let's see, what am I missing? Mambo, so
Yeah.
like
Mambo. Yeah.
so you need to develop, I guess, a certain vocabulary for these styles. Like you can't be playing bossa nova and have it sound like, big band swing.
No,
You
of course.
just
Yeah. 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 No,
so like
exactly.
so what, are there some common riffs that you can develop, or is there a resource for, maybe some certain pieces that would help
Yeah,
you get
I
those
mean,
down?
I'm gonna be honest with you, Dave.
Hmm.
That actually, did I study this? Did I do this? Is there a book that I can, well, I mean, I think it actually has to do a little bit with my background. I grew up as a young child in Venezuela, and I was exposed to a lot of this different music. Like, so no, like you're saying, that's correct. We cannot play everything, and of course, I cannot play ballroom music with the same chords that I will play a bebop tune. For example, if I'm play, waltz, for example, is one of the very, very common dance forms that you use in a ballroom. So, example. I mean, obviously, I could not play. I mean, that becomes complicated because, of course, the listeners, they're gonna go, you need to fire the band. I mean, they're not. So you gotta, when you do something like the ballroom gig that we're talking about, you gotta stick to some parameters. This is not gonna be jazz waltz. You have to be careful with tempo. You cannot play something like Cherokee. I mean, has to know the speed of it, because otherwise people go, right. And of course, length of music. I remember Alan always, every single year, he'll tell me, make sure that none of the songs are longer than 3 minutes. And I'm like, I know, Alan, I've been doing this for a long time. But, yeah, it's not like when you go to a jazz jam and a song lasts 18 minutes because everybody wants to take 12 choruses, I mean, through a song. So
well, one of the books that I have, I don't have it here, but I may get this wrong, but it was one thing that we got in the course at School of the Arts in Ron Rudkin's class, and that was I think is it Dick Grove? It's Arranging Concepts. It's basically for big band arrangers. And there's a whole glossary of like, here's the things you should have if you're doing samba. Here's the things you should have to do merengue. I don't know if there's anything like that for pianists, but it might be worth getting a jazz book.
I'm honestly not that familiar, and I don't know that book because I never took an arranging class. I mean, I don't, I just don't, I'm not an arranger, so it's hard for me to tell. I'm familiar with that. There are some specific rhythms to bossa nova, obviously. Let's take that, for example. And there's a couple of slight variations of this. I'm going to play again, just a very short example with a 2-5-1. Some people will say, do not play in Brazil. You don't play the bass line like this. And we're getting out to a very, very nitty-gritty of. That's kind of more of an Americanized way of playing, bossa. Some people would say you just play the root and the fifth on 1 and on 3. And so forth. A samba tends to be, this is actually my 99 cents version of what a samba is. Pretty much is an accelerated bossa. Brazil or something like that. Then waltz, of course. If I'm gonna give you an example of a waltz. If I play Someday My Prince Will Come in a jazz version, it will be more colorful. If I'm gonna play it in a ballroom situation, I may do it. Obviously, the chord has to be. I still can add a jazz flavor, but in a much more, not as a dense of a chord. Basically, a little bit more open, so a little simpler.
Right. What's the type of music goes da 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 da?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. That is actually, it's called salsa, which actually which has this very, very, and again, there are all these different variations. I must say that one of the greatest excitements of the past years that I played, I'm the jazz pianist for the Camel City Jazz Orchestra, and we did a salsa concert, and I love that.
Oh, nice.
There's actually, and this is very, very basic. Then, of course, there are little variations. So that's actually gets into what we also call as a montuno. There's a thing called tumbao. And I was playing with all this group of wonderful Puerto Rican musicians, which play everything by ear. And they were explaining me, well, what you're doing is a little bit different. It's called this, it's called that. So yeah, it's always a beautiful learning experience for myself because I'm,
Right.
I can do it, but I would say I'm an eminence on this. I mean, I just have a general knowledge, and of course, then I'll tweak it depending on what
Right.
what is needed. So
Okay.
yeah,
So, some of you watching or listening, you might be feeling overwhelmed. That's a lot of information. I would say take what you have where you are. But I think something that everybody can do is just go listen to some jazz
absolutely.
recordings. So, like, what are a few you would say if it's like? Well, I'll ask you two questions. Like, what do you think would be some good things for those new that are trying to get into jazz? And then, maybe the same answer, but what are some of your favorites?
I suggest, for example, one of my favorite recordings is "Kind of Blue" by Miles Davis.
Yeah.
Also because you have I also like "Time Out" by Dave Brubeck, which is a little
Hmm.
bit more complex. Um, and then some of my favorite pianists, and this gets into more complex. I love Keith Jarrett, Bill Evans, absolutely.
Hmm.
Chick Corea was an incredible musician, and you can even go back a little bit more. Art Tatum, I mean, which is more Oscar Peterson, but their playing is usually it can be overwhelming. I mean, for a listener, my gosh, how was it doing that? But what
Right.
I love, for example, at by Miles, I mean, the tune called "So What," and it's pretty much you can improvise on a Dorian mode, and in the piano, what we call it's all the Y keys.
Yep.
And there is basically not a single wrong note on that. Now, then it goes up a half step. But again, that I think that's probably one of my favorite, I will say, always go to albums that said if you want to introduce somebody to jazz. It's
Yeah.
the music is gorgeous, the players are fantastic, the the charts are not terribly, I mean, the chord progression is, I shouldn't say simple. There's one but this, for example, that song that I just mentioned, it's fairly accessible, I would say. So
Right. I'll say one thing about jazz, and not to compare it to classical, but maybe to compare it to rock. One thing I think that jazz does really well is that you can get superstars together and do great work. Like, it doesn't always work out in rock, but like, Kind of Blue, if you look at the personnel on that, it's they're all like superstars.
oh, absolutely. That's what I love about going to a jam session. A jam session is, for all the listeners who are not, it's just a group of musicians getting together and just playing songs. And then you develop a language. Who's going to count the tune off? There are some specific endings.
Mhm.
There are, then we can do what we call trade fours, which the drummer will play 4 bars by himself, then another musician will improvise. So the song is divided into 4 bars of drums, 4 bars, or whoever wants to do it. So yeah, and it happens also in rock. I mean, but you have to be specific on what to. Probably it's easiest to put a jazz tune together than will be a rock tune that has different parts, because you have to rehearse it sometime. And also you do the same thing in jazz. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes when you get into more complex stuff, I mean, it's just, I'm just going to show up and sight read. No. You have to make sure that
Yeah,
you're, that you practice it just like anything else. So,
exactly.
yeah.
I guess I'll probably do this in the introduction, but just in case I forget, for the listeners, let's say that you're a classical musician, you're maybe not yet persuaded that this is something that you should explore. I mean, I'll just say we're recording this, in advance. This is on a Friday that we're recording.
Mhm.
Um, in an hour and a half after we discontinue, I'm going to be heading over to a retirement center that I play at once a month, and I have a gig book, a
Yes.
notebook, and in that notebook I don't have Well, first of all, they actually like a little bit of classical music,
Sure.
but they don't want all classical music. They want
No.
some things that they remember from the 40s and the 30s, and I don't have 7, 8 page arrangements of each one. I've got lead sheets, and also the jazz. If you're confident in jazz, you don't always have to play the way you practiced before. You can have a little fun with it. You can say, I think I'm going to try this,
Yeah.
and do a little something different, on the spot. So
Yeah.
that is, and I'm a classical pianist, and I will do this for dinner music too. Although if I'm playing, where it's kind of understood it's like classical, then I might take out some of the ninths and 11ths, and I might
Absolutely.
mellow jazz a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the retirement home, because actually I played for many, many years at a retirement home in Greensboro. I would play there probably twice a month in the afternoon. And it was, yeah, I never touched anything that was too avant-garde. People will ask me things like, what is the name of the song? Sentimental Journey,
Oh
you
yeah.
know, because generally the first thing that I will do, okay, let's look, most likely it's going to be an older audience who
Hmm.
remembers, songs from the 40s, from the big band era, in the mood, things like that. So ballads like Misty. So yeah, you have to. I've had some situations here with providers. I said, well, such and such came over, but he did not play exactly what we were looking for. We started playing a lot of people's stuff. So you have to be a little careful. I
Yeah.
mean, not careful. You just have to know the style, for example. And I'm referring to this
Yeah.
to your gig that you're about to do
Right.
uh, at a retirement home. Yes, you need to keep it within that that vintage. I mean that age group. So
So yeah, just for the benefit of those, you want to know what I'm talking about. So these are the songs that I'm doing today. Uh, now I'm just going to list the jazz numbers. I've got a set starts with a I get a kick out of you.
absolutely,
Crazy he calls me time after time, but not
yes,
for me. And then see, then I have a Debussy piece I put in there just to break it up, and I've got the way you look tonight. Uh,
absolutely,
Duke Ellington don't get around much anymore.
yes,
I'm getting sentimental over you, and
yes.
then uh, and they like when I do a religious piece every now and then. So I've got a song in there, and then I've got Stella by Starlight, my favorite
Mhm.
things, all the things you are, all the way, and then I've got a list of if time, and I'm going to put an arrangement of they like classical, so I've got Strauss's Emperor's Waltz, version of that. So it's a nice mix, and it'll take about an hour, and those are just kinds of songs. So the you offered a lot of great books, a lot of great choices of listening. I'll go ahead and just suggest to everybody the thing that really I think helped me get into it. There's a lot of real books, a lot of fake books that are called real
Yeah.
books. There's one out there, and I can't tell you the publisher, but it's called the Standards Real Book. It's
Okay.
based on the new Real Book series. It doesn't have the as much of the handwritten jazz font. It has
Right.
more of a
Yeah. Yeah. I know what you're
engraved.
talking about.
But the other thing I like about it is it's a lot of famous songs, but it'll give you alternate chord suggestions in parentheses.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
it's like you can play this line or you can play this line, and
Yes.
it gives you a lot of great ideas, I think.
Yeah. I am not sure of the book, but what I guess is probably one chord progression is going to be a little bit more colorful,
Yeah.
more what we talk more jazz oriented. But yeah, all the songs. For example, Dave, I'm going to show you this real quick. This is actually when you were talking about. This is a song list. The paper is about to be destroyed. It's falling apart.
Uh-huh.
And when I used to play at this retirement home, they love, for example, very quickly, Carolina Moon. Oh, what a beautiful morning. Sorry, my voice is terrible. Edelweiss, Sentimental Journey, On the Sunny Side of the Street. And again, I will not play anything to it had to be you, my favorite things, making whoopee, go figure, stormy weather, when the saints come marching in. Anyway, so I went a couple of times and I could hear that, nah, stop playing that, don't do that. So after a couple of gigs, I made myself a list that I knew it would be likely, and I would be more than happy to share it with you.
Right.
So you're about to look at it. But no,
Um,
the selections that you mentioned are fantastic. So
oh, thank you. Um, So, just kind of wrapping up here, I don't where I guess you can offer what you'd like to share. People might want to hear you play other than on a a Zoom
Yeah,
video recording.
right.
Uh,
Yeah.
is there a way that people can find out where you're playing next? Or
Yes.
yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I use my Facebook page. I mean, it's just Federico Pivetta. I post things. I don't have. We used to have a website, and it got hacked, and then we lost our domain. It's a long story.
Mm,
I do. People can reach me via email. I don't know if you want to add it. I do have a YouTube channel. Not very, very. Doesn't have a lot of stuff in it. Another. Also, I would like to mention that I play almost every Sunday at Centenary United Methodist Church here in Winston, and that's actually is a jazz inspired service, and we've
mhm,
been doing it for 12 years. It's been incredibly successful. It's myself on piano, Martha Bassett on vocals, Ken Wilmot on trumpet, John Wilson on drums, and Matt Kendrick on bass. And
mhm.
we are a group that we're incredibly good friends, and we play together. We've been playing together for a very, very long time. Um, but yeah, I generally Facebook. I'm on Instagram also. I have my cell phone number. People can reach me on my email fpvera@icloud.com. So yeah, that's. But I generally do my best to try to publish it on social media.
Okay.
Uh, as much as I can. So
Well, I realized I wasn't sure how this conversation was going to flow when we got into it, and I realized that this is it's a lot for one for
I
one
know, and
episode.
we could go on for the whole day if you
Yeah, I
if you
know.
wanted to, but understand there's a time limit, and I hope I didn't go. I was trying to stay
No,
with the subject as much as possible. So
no. Fred, thank you for taking time to chat
thanks for
today.
having me.
And
Absolutely.
if we have jazz questions down the road, we may have you pop on just for maybe a little bit more narrow of a topic. But thank you
Absolutely.
for getting us going with this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and appreciate your. Thank you for having me. I look forward to yeah any for the next one. Absolutely.
Yes. And that will conclude episode 6. I hope you learned something today. And again, if you are unclear on anything we talked about, want to know more, or if you have suggestions based on this conversation of something you want us to do a deeper dive into, this podcast is going to be here for the long term, and we want to come back to it. Also, if you have tips to offer about playing jazz on your instruments, not the piano, but it's kind of tailored toward beginners, um, I would love it if you would choose to leave me a voice message through the SpeakPipe link. It's actually SpeakPipe, SpeakPipe.com/musician toolkit. And you can leave a voice message there. I can include it in show, and we can talk about it. Or, again, send me a direct message on any of the social media platforms, which includes TikTok and Instagram at David Lane Music, Facebook at David M. Lane Music, and I don't think you can leave me a message on YouTube. You could leave a comment in the video. It's at David Lane Music 1. And you can also send me a message through my website, davidlanemusic.com/contact. Once again, thank you for listening. Please leave a 5-star rating and review if you enjoyed this episode, and please share it at least with one other person. I will see you next week.